Okay, this video is going to be American Indians and Spanish exploration, specifically Hernando de Soto. All right. Standard SS8H1. Who were the first people in North America? The first nomadic people crossed into North America, remember, across the Bering Strait. We talked about how they immigrated from Asia. There's no true natives to North America. This was back in 30,000 BC. Now, those people, those nomads, evolve into the Paleo, the Archaic, and the Woodland. You don't need to know all that specific. What you need to know is that they eventually evolve into the Mississippian. That is what you need to know. Mississippian, okay? The age of exploration for European countries is 1500s and 1600s. So at this time when they start exploring, American Indians were already living here in present-day America. Not that the Europeans knew that, okay? These Mississippian Indians, we know that they lived in tribes of thousands of families. Big, huge tribes, all right? They, their culture involved decorative dress. They tattooed their bodies for special ceremonies or events. They used temple mounts for those religious ceremonies, for burials, for community meetings. We have lots of artifacts and some of the temple mounts still left over showing what they used in that time. There we have the one right here that is up there on the way to Helen, if you've ever seen it. Food that they ate, large variety of crops. They've developed horticulture at this point, which just means farming and growing crops such as corn, squash, pumpkins, beans, sunflowers. So someone was responsible for doing that. Other people were responsible for going out and hunting. Deer, turkey, rabbit, pretty much anything they could shoot. They also knew how to fish and had fashioned fish hooks out of bone. If you look down here, we have fish hooks fashioned out of bone. That was one of their tools. They had weapons such as the bow and arrow. They used arrowheads. They had knives. They had scrapers. They had spears that they would use to throw, and axes to either chop things or, I guess if necessary, kill an animal. They did not have guns. No guns. Their shelter was huts. Remember, that was, if there was one word we could use to describe their shelter, it was a hut. It's walls made of a network of interwoven sticks, and then they pack mud and clay around it to kind of keep out the bugs and keep out the weather. Their cooking and other activities would take place out here in this more central area outside of the hut, but inside there in that one-room hut, they just used it for sleeping. That was the entire point of that hut, protection for sleeping. Those Mississippians eventually evolved into the tribes that remained in Georgia until the 1800s, which, as you know at this point, we talked about in later history. These two major tribes are the Creek and the Cherokee. Okay. Okay, background information. In the 15th century, Europe and Asia were much more modern. They were living in cities. They had much more advances, not as advanced as we are today. Clearly no electricity, no sewage system, but more advanced than what the Native Americans had. So these people in the old world had no idea that this new world even existed over here. They wanted these items from Asia, the spices, the cloth, the silk, the fabrics, and they didn't like traveling from here in Europe all the way over the land masses to Asia. So their thought was to find a water route to go buy all those goods that they wanted. In 1492, Christopher Columbus received permission from the monarchs of Spain to try and find a water route to Asia, okay? He's Italian, but he goes to speak to the Spanish monarchs, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, to get the permission and the money from them to sail. They finance him on his voyage with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, crew, all the men that he needs to sail the ships, and food. So they set sail for Asia by sailing west. Instead, they land in the Bahamas, okay? So he lands here, but he thinks he's here because his geographical knowledge was so limited at that point. So he just starts, because he thinks he's in India, he starts calling the natives that he finds there in the Bahamas, he calls them Indians. This discovery makes Spain very wealthy, and they become the dominant world power. And once they do this, France and England want in on that too. They're not okay with Spain having all the money and all the riches and all the glory. They want some for themselves. So these two other countries get in the exploration game. Okay, so we see that Columbus, 1492, and then Spain starts to explore in the early 1500s. Then 100 years later, England starts to explore and settle, and a little bit after that, France explores and settles some in the New World as well. All right, and then eventually we become a colony here in Georgia in 1732. All right, so Spain, their focus, God, glory, and gold. If you remember the 3 G's, you're doing good. They wanted to find that water route to Asia. They wanted gold, land, and resources. They wanted power and wealth, okay? And on a side note, they wanted to spread Christianity. They felt that the American Indians, the Native Americans, they were heathens living here, and they wanted to educate them and bring religion to them. They settle in South and Central America. If you think about the languages that are spoken down there, they're predominantly Spanish. They settle in Florida and Georgia's barrier islands. Eventually missions are set up there. This is all in the 1500s. They're the first Europeans to explore over here in North and South America. When they show up with guns, with horses that the American Indians have never seen before. Attack dogs, remember we talked. They trained the attack dogs to haul off and kill someone to terrify the other natives. They have a trained army. They bring diseases that the Native Americans have never been exposed to, and the psychological advantage. They show up in this big, huge ship. They come off the ship, possibly on top of a horse, wearing armor. So these Native Americans see these men, and their first thought is they must be gods. The Native Americans, on the other hand, in the comparison, they only have bows and arrows, no guns, no horses, armored dogs. They're not trained as well because they're not fighters. They have never had the intention of taking over any other country or any other people, so they don't need to know how to do that. They have a low immunity because they've not been exposed to these diseases, and they thought the Spanish were gods. And when you start off with a thought like that, you're not as likely to fight someone who shows up. If you think they're a god, you're willing to do what they tell you to do. Hernando de Soto. We've talked about him plenty. He was the Spanish explorer, traveled through Georgia looking for gold. He was not a nice guy. He was not a good guy. He never found gold. Remember, his expedition was not a success, but he greatly affected natives in Georgia. He was the one that would have his dogs eat somebody to terrify everyone else in the village, to try and encourage them to share any gold they might have or any other wealth. So he had 600 men with him, and they searched for wealth and had conflicts with the natives in the attempt to get this wealth. This red line here is his expedition until he dies, okay? And then his men bury him, and they explore some more, and they come back and they decide to just head back to Spain. They are done. He manages to bring war and disease to the natives. His impact is felt for generations, the number of people that are killed by his dogs, by his guns, and by the diseases he carried. He also brought new technology, culture, and a way of life to the Native Americans, those that survived his expedition. The Spanish set up missions on Georgia's barrier islands in the late 1500s and 1600s. They were Catholic. They wanted to spread their religion and share it with the natives because they felt that they needed to learn about Christianity. Their missions were successful in the fact that some natives did accept Catholicism. Some listened to their teachings and went along with it. Others revolted. I would imagine this is because the teachings was not like what you and I would experience today. It was a lot more forceful, probably some threats involved. So some of them, such as Juanillo, fought back because they didn't like that. Okay. Here's our barrier islands. There were missions on St. Catharines, Sapelo, St. Simons, and Cumberland. And that is it for